The sun sets over a ruined palace. Crumbled walls, broken tablets, and fire-scorched stones lie buried beneath centuries of silence. What happened here? Who once walked these halls, ruled these lands, and sent their armies and envoys across seas and deserts? Around the year 1200 BCE, the ancient world suffered a catastrophe so immense, so far-reaching, that it sent entire civilizations into ruin. The Bronze Age collapse, as it is now known, was not merely the fall of a city or the death of a dynasty. It was the disintegration of an entire international system. Great empires that had stood for centuries, powerful, prosperous, and deeply interconnected, vanished almost overnight. Their palaces burned. Their writing systems disappeared. Their cities were abandoned and left to the wilderness. At the height of the late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were thriving. Trade networks stretched from Mycenaean Greece to Babylon, connecting kingdoms through goods, diplomacy, and culture. Gold from Nubia, tin from Central Asia, copper from Cyprus, and spices from the Levant all flowed across a well-oiled system of ports, merchant fleets, and caravans. Egyptian pharaohs corresponded with Hittite kings. Mycenaean warriors fought alongside or against their Anatolian counterparts. It was a world not unlike our own, interconnected, sophisticated, and reliant on international cooperation. And then it fell apart. Within just a few decades, cities were burned to the ground. Long-standing dynasties were overthrown. Writing systems like Linear B and Hittite cuneiform were lost to time. Trade routes collapsed. Literacy, artistry, and engineering, hallmarks of high civilization, vanished across entire regions. What caused this sudden and dramatic unraveling of some of the most advanced societies of the ancient world? Was it a change in the climate? A wave of earthquakes? A mysterious confederation of invaders known only as the Sea Peoples? Or was it something deeper? A systemic collapse triggered by multiple overlapping stresses? This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse, a tale of destruction and transformation, of fire and rebirth. It is a story not just of what was lost, but of how the ancient world reinvented itself in the wake of disaster. As we journey through the ruins, records, and riddles of this pivotal moment in history, we uncover a world-altering event that changed the course of civilization forever. Before its collapse, the Bronze Age world was a marvel of human achievement, a golden era where powerful kingdoms thrived, cultures flourished, and trade routes spanned continents. From the shores of the Aegean to the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East were alive with activity, innovation, and diplomacy. This was a world bound together not only by war and conquest, but also by a sophisticated network of exchange, both material and cultural. At the heart of this world stood mighty civilizations. Egypt, in its New Kingdom period, was enjoying the height of its wealth and power, ruled by pharaohs like Ramses II, who commanded armies, raised temples, and negotiated with foreign kings. In the highlands of Anatolia, the Hittite Empire emerged as a formidable rival, controlling key trade routes and dominating the politics of the Near East. Across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean Greeks constructed vast citadels, palatial complexes with high walls and grand halls, adorned with frescoes and treasures from distant lands. These were the people who would later inspire Homer's epics, and though their names are barely remembered today, they were once players on the great stage of history. The world they inhabited was deeply interconnected. Ships laden with copper, tin, wine, olive oil, and luxury goods crisscrossed the Mediterranean, linking the island of Cyprus with the coasts of Syria, Crete, and the Nile Delta. Merchant caravans stretched across deserts, carrying lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, horses from the steppes, and incense from Arabia. This international trade was not just economic, it was political and diplomatic. Kings exchanged letters, brides, and treasures. Treaties were signed and sealed with gifts and formal titles. The Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablets found in Egypt, reveal a vibrant correspondence between rulers. Evidence of a diplomatic world order not unlike that of modern nations. Bronze, the defining metal of the era, was both the engine and the symbol of this globalized system. It required a mixture of copper and tin, two metals that rarely occurred together. This necessity forced regions into cooperation and dependence. If the flow of tin from the east or copper from the Mediterranean was interrupted, the entire balance of power could shift. It was a delicate, interwoven web of trade, diplomacy, and warfare. Yet the world of the Late Bronze Age was not only about kings and empires. It was a world of artisans, priests, scribes, and traders. In cities like Ugarit, people wrote in multiple languages, worshipped a pantheon of gods, and sent ships across the sea in pursuit of profit. In Mycenae and Knossos, architects and engineers built multi-story palaces with plumbing, ventilation, and vibrant wall paintings. In Babylon, astronomers charted the stars while scribes recorded laws, myths, and omens on clay tablets. This was a world that valued learning and legacy. Across regions, cultures preserved their stories in writing. On stone, clay, and parchment, religious traditions flourished, and philosophical ideas were quietly taking root. A spirit of experimentation, trade, and ambition defined the Late Bronze Age. Though these societies were not unified under one empire, they shared a common rhythm, a fragile but impressive harmony of civilization. But beneath the grandeur lay vulnerability. These palace economies were heavily centralized, dependent on a strong king, an elite bureaucracy, and carefully managed resources. They were brilliant, but brittle. What would happen, then, if the trade routes faltered, if the harvests failed, if the palaces burned? As we look back on this high point of ancient civilization, it becomes clear that the Bronze Age was not simply a period of technological advancement. It was the first great age of internationalism. And, as history would soon show, it was an age that could not last forever. Even at the height of prosperity, subtle signs of decay were beginning to surface across the Bronze Age world. What appeared, on the surface, to be a network of stable and thriving empires was, in reality, an intricate and delicate system, highly interdependent and dangerously exposed to disruption. Beneath the towering palaces and glistening trade ships, stress was building. And like a great structure straining under unseen weight, the first cracks began to form long before the walls gave way. Some of the earliest warnings came not in dramatic invasions or grand battles, but in the quiet whispers of nature. Across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, the climate began to change. Evidence from lake sediments, pollen samples, and tree rings reveals a period of extended drought beginning around 1200 BCE. Rainfall declined. Crops withered in the fields. Rivers dried to a trickle. Famine took root. For economies that depended on agricultural surplus to feed workers, armies, and royal courts, this was not just a natural setback. It was a foundational threat. As food supplies dwindled, the burden on centralized systems grew. Palaces, once centers of wealth and redistribution, found themselves unable to meet the needs of their people. In places like the Hittite Empire, grain shipments became more erratic, and hunger turned into unrest. Even mighty Egypt, rich in the silt of the Nile, began recording instances of food shortages and civil disorder. A once stable world was beginning to fray at the edges, but it wasn't just the environment that signaled coming collapse. Across the landscape, cities that had stood for centuries began to show signs of decline. Archaeological layers revealed destruction by fire, abrupt abandonment, and hurried reconstructions, evidence of either external assault or internal turmoil. In some regions, defensive walls were hastily built or reinforced. People were afraid. Something was coming. Compounding these pressures were a series of devastating earthquakes. The eastern Mediterranean lies atop multiple fault lines, and it appears that around the same time as the droughts, a series of powerful tremors struck key urban centers. Palaces in Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant bear the hallmarks of seismic destruction. Collapsed walls, crushed pottery, and entire floors reduced to rubble. For cities already weakened by famine and instability, these quakes were catastrophic, toppling structures and shattering the illusion of divine protection that many rulers claimed to possess. At the same time, the tightly controlled systems of governance began to falter. Records from Ugarit and other cities show a growing sense of desperation. Letters plead for aid, warn of invasions, and report missing trade shipments. In one such tablet, a desperate ruler writes that his enemy is approaching and that he has no ships left with which to escape. He does not survive. In some kingdoms, the central authority collapsed from within. Elite classes, long sustained by palace economies, found themselves unable to maintain their privileges. This triggered power struggles, uprisings, and in some cases, the outright rejection of the old order. There are signs that slaves and laborers, long oppressed under rigid hierarchies, seized the moment to revolt. Some of the destruction seen in Mycenaean palaces may have been the work of their own people, uprisings against kings who could no longer protect or feed them. The international order, once held together by diplomacy and mutual benefit, began to unravel. Trade routes became unsafe. Merchant vessels disappeared. Diplomatic letters went unanswered. The flow of tin, copper, and other essential materials slowed to a trickle. With it came a grinding halt to the production of bronze, the metal that defined the age. It was not just a political or economic collapse. It was the unraveling of a technological system that entire civilizations depended on. By the end of the 13th century BCE, the stage was set for something far greater than localized decline. Empires were weakened, cities were vulnerable, people were hungry, angry, and frightened. The great tapestry of the Bronze Age world, once so carefully woven, was coming apart thread by thread. What followed was not simply a moment of destruction. It was a storm of upheaval that would sweep across continents, a force so disruptive that few would remain untouched by it. And at its center was a mysterious and terrifying presence, one that emerged suddenly, struck without mercy, and vanished into history with barely a trace. The Sea Peoples. They came from the sea, swift, brutal, and relentless. Entire cities fell before their advance. Empires that had stood for centuries crumbled in their wake. Their name is etched into ancient stone, not as a people, but as a force of devastation. To the Egyptians, they were simply called the Sea Peoples. Even today, over 3,000 years later, the identity and origin of these mysterious invaders remain among the greatest riddles of ancient history. They left behind no cities of their own, no language, no clear legacy, only destruction. And yet, in the twilight of the Bronze Age, their arrival became the spark that turned a world already on edge into one engulfed in flames. It is in Egypt, under the reign of Pharaoh Ramses III, that we find the most vivid record of their assault. On the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, a dramatic series of reliefs and hieroglyphs tells the story of a terrifying enemy. They are depicted with feathered headdresses, round shields, and swords. Some arriving on ships, others sweeping across the land with ox-drawn carts, families in tow. These were not just warriors. They were entire peoples on the move, men, women, and children, uprooted, displaced, and desperate. Ramses III describes them as a confederation of tribes: the Peleset, Sherdan, Tjeker, Shekelesh, and Denyen, among others. Their origins are debated. Some may have come from the Aegean Islands, others from Anatolia, or even as far west as the Balkans or Italy. What is clear is that they were not an organized army from a single state. They were a migratory force, perhaps driven by famine, climate change, or political collapse in their own lands. Wherever they went, cities burned. Before reaching Egypt, they swept through the Levant, ravaging ports, pillaging palaces, and leaving trails of destruction that archaeologists are still uncovering today. One of their most tragic victims was the great city of Ugarit, a thriving port on the coast of modern Syria. At the height of the Bronze Age, Ugarit was a hub of trade, culture, and diplomacy. Its palaces were filled with scrolls, its scribes fluent in multiple languages. And then, silence. Excavations reveal that Ugarit was violently destroyed around 1190 BCE. Among the rubble, archaeologists discovered letters that had never been sent, messages from the king begging allies for help, warning of incoming attackers. His pleas came too late. The city was never rebuilt. The Sea Peoples didn't just target minor ports or fringe territories. They struck at the very heart of the great powers. In Anatolia, the once mighty Hittite Empire collapsed so completely that its capital, Hattusa, disappeared from history. Its records ended abruptly, its palaces deserted. The empire that had rivaled Egypt and ruled vast swaths of the Near East was no more. In the Greek world, the Mycenaean citadels met a similar fate. Mycenae, Tyrans, and Pylos, fortified cities filled with warriors and treasure, were burned and abandoned. The palatial culture that had once boasted monumental architecture, intricate bureaucracy, and written language dissolved. Greece plunged into centuries of darkness, a period so obscure that modern historians refer to it simply as the Greek Dark Age. Even Egypt, though victorious in its battles against the Sea Peoples, did not escape unscathed. Ramses III fought two major campaigns against them, one on land, another at sea. His inscriptions boast of triumph, of enemies slain and ships captured. But behind the bravado is the reality of a kingdom under siege. The cost of these wars was immense. Grain supplies were drained, the treasury weakened, and Egypt's control over its empire in Canaan was lost. It was a Pyrrhic victory, one that left Egypt diminished, entering a slow but steady decline from which it never truly recovered. In the aftermath of the Sea People's invasions, the geography of power shifted dramatically. Many of the old kingdoms ceased to exist. Others were reduced to small city-states or regional powers. The diplomatic and trade networks that had sustained the Bronze Age world were shattered. Languages and writing systems disappeared. Population centers were abandoned. It was, in every sense, a civilizational collapse. But were the Sea Peoples the cause, or merely the consequence, of a world already unraveling? Most modern scholars view them not as the origin of the collapse, but as one of its final, most violent expressions. Their movements were likely triggered by the same factors that had weakened the great empires: drought, famine, earthquakes, and internal rebellion. They were, perhaps, the face of desperation. A human wave sweeping across the Mediterranean in search of survival, bringing chaos with them. And yet, their impact was undeniable. The Sea Peoples were the harbingers of an ending. They delivered the final blow to a world that had, for centuries, rested on a delicate balance. In their wake, they left ashes and silence. But out of that silence, something new would eventually rise. By the early 12th century BCE, the great lights of the Bronze Age had all but gone out. What had once been a thriving, interconnected world, a network of empires, cities, trade, and diplomacy, now lay in ruins. The destruction was not uniform, nor was it immediate. Some cities clung to life for a generation longer than others. Some cultures adapted, shifted, or migrated. But the larger picture was unmistakable. A world order that had taken centuries to build collapsed in a matter of decades. The fall was not merely political. It was systemic. It reached into every part of life: government, economy, technology, language, even memory. With the destruction of palaces and administrative centers, the highly centralized systems that had defined Bronze Age governance crumbled. These were not democratic societies that could adapt to the fall of a king or the loss of a capital. The state itself was often synonymous with the ruler. When the palace burned, the kingdom died with it. In Greece, the Mycenaean citadels, once bustling centers of administration and power, were reduced to empty shells. Linear B, the earliest form of written Greek, vanished from use, along with the bureaucratic scribes who had preserved it. Without writing, the oral tradition took over. History became myth. Real kings became the stuff of legend. Their deeds remembered not in records, but in epic poetry. The stories of the Trojan War, the wanderings of Odysseus, and the wrath of Achilles may have been born in the flickering firelight of a post-collapse world, when people still remembered the grandeur of the past but could no longer fully explain it. In the Levant and Anatolia, cities like Ugarit, Hattusa, and Al-Alach ceased to exist. Their temples were buried. Their archives, sealed in the fire and ash of sudden destruction, were lost for millennia. Entire writing systems disappeared, some of which would never be deciphered again. The bureaucratic sophistication that had supported trade, taxation, and diplomacy gave way to local subsistence economies. Internationalism faded into isolation. Even Egypt, though not destroyed, emerged from the crisis wounded and diminished. Ramses III's victories over the Sea Peoples did not prevent the slow decay of Egyptian power. The empire's grip on Canaan slipped away. The royal treasury was drained. Internal corruption and political fragmentation set in. The monumental construction of earlier dynasties ceased. And by the end of the 20th dynasty, Egypt itself had entered a period of division and weakness. Elsewhere, a new social geography was taking shape. As old cities fell, new settlements rose, often smaller, more modest, and less centralized. People moved inland, away from vulnerable coastlines. Hilltop villages appeared in places where palaces once commanded armies. Populations became more mobile, more agrarian, and more inward-looking. The elite classes of scribes, merchants, and priest kings gave way to local chieftains and warrior leaders. This was not just a collapse, it was a transformation, a de-urbanization of civilization, a regression, some might say, but also a rebirth in disguise. Trade did not disappear entirely, but it changed form. The great sea routes that once carried bronze, spices, and luxury goods between distant ports were no longer safe or profitable. Instead, local exchange networks began to emerge, trading necessities rather than luxuries. Craftsmanship survived, but with fewer resources and simpler forms. Pottery styles became more utilitarian. Monumental art gave way to household decoration. The bronze that once armed chariots and decorated temples was now hoarded, recycled, and rationed. With the breakdown of global connections came the rise of regional identities. People no longer saw themselves primarily as subjects of vast empires or members of cosmopolitan trade networks. Instead, they belonged to tribes, villages, or local communities. This shift laid the groundwork for the ethnic and political groups that would define the early Iron Age: Philistines, Hebrews, Aramaeans, and Phoenicians among them. One of the most profound consequences of this collapse was the loss of memory. So much of what defined the Late Bronze Age, the records, the traditions, the architectural achievements, was forgotten by those who came after. In Greece, writing would not reappear for nearly 4 centuries. The names of kings, the treaties between nations, the scientific knowledge, all were buried under layers of dust and myth. The world had entered a dark age. Not because people vanished, but because the light of history dimmed. Writing, architecture, long-distance trade, and centralized government all faded from the landscape. For a time, the Mediterranean was quieter, its coastlines dotted with ruins, its people scattered and cautious, its stories passed down not by inscription, but by voice. And yet, in this darkness, seeds were being planted. Though the great palaces were gone, the people remained. Though writing was lost, language survived. Though trade faltered, the knowledge of metallurgy and agriculture endured. Communities adapted, developed new customs, and learned to live in the world that remained. This was not the end of civilization. It was the closing of one chapter and the quiet beginning of another. When modern historians look back at the Bronze Age collapse, they do not see a single clear cause. There was no great volcanic eruption that blackened the skies, no singular conqueror who marched from one end of the known world to the other. Instead, what they find is a complex tapestry of overlapping crises, environmental, political, economic, and social, all striking within the span of a few decades. It was not one blade that brought the Bronze Age to its knees, but many. Together, they formed a perfect storm. The first and perhaps most devastating blow came from nature itself. Paleoclimatic data, gleaned from ice cores, tree rings, and ancient sediments, suggests that the eastern Mediterranean experienced a severe and prolonged drought beginning around 1200 BCE. Rainfall declined, harvests failed, rivers and wells dried up. The lands that had fed empires began to starve them. In regions where agriculture was already precarious, even small changes in climate had catastrophic effects. The great grain stores of palace economies, once abundant, began to run low. Without food, the political foundations of these kingdoms began to crack. This climate shock did not occur in isolation. Earthquakes, many of them powerful and closely timed, struck major cities across the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant. Archaeological evidence shows collapsed walls, pancaked buildings, and cities hastily rebuilt or left abandoned. The theory of an earthquake storm, a series of seismic events across a geologically active region, has gained traction among scholars. These quakes would have come without warning, destroying palaces, temples, and grain stores already under strain. For a population already facing hunger and unrest, The shaking of the very ground beneath their feet must have felt apocalyptic. Famine and earthquakes weakened the structures of society, but human beings added fuel to the fire. As palace economies faltered, their carefully controlled systems of redistribution broke down. The elite could no longer feed their dependents or maintain loyalty through privilege and gift-giving. Without economic security, local populations began to revolt. There are signs that the destruction of many Mycenaean palaces was not the work of foreign invaders, but of internal uprising. The same may be true of Hittite cities and Levantine towns. The very people who had built the Bronze Age world may have helped tear it down when the promises of their rulers turned to ash. Then came the migrations. Out of the north, out of the sea, came groups displaced by famine, conflict, or collapse in their own homelands. We call them the Sea Peoples, but they were likely many different peoples, traveling in waves, seeking new lands. Some came as conquerors, others as refugees. They did not arrive in isolation, but in the context of a crumbling world, one in which every kingdom was already weakened, every wall already shaken. Their raids and invasions intensified the disintegration. Cities that had survived drought and rebellion fell to fire and sword. The Hittite Empire, perhaps already hollowed out by internal decay, vanished after waves of attack. In the Levant, port cities like Ugarit and Byblos were sacked or forced to change entirely. Even Egypt, though it repelled the Sea Peoples militarily, could not escape the economic exhaustion their arrival caused. Trade, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age, withered. The long-distance exchange of copper, tin, gold, ivory, and spices relied on stability. Merchant routes were no longer safe. Ports were abandoned or destroyed. The sea itself, once a highway of commerce, had become a war zone. Without trade, cities could not access critical resources. Without those resources, economies collapsed. Bronze became scarce, and weapon production declined. Armies shrank, and defense systems crumbled. The loss of trade didn't just impoverish the region, it severed the ties that held the ancient world together. Compounding all of this was the disappearance of writing systems. Many of the cultures of the late Bronze Age depended on palace scribes to maintain their records. When palaces were destroyed, these scribes perished or fled. With them went knowledge of law, of trade agreements, of history and identity. In Greece, the fall of the palaces marked the end of Linear B, and writing would not return for over 400 years. In the Levant and Anatolia, cuneiform disappeared from all but a few enclaves. Literacy had been the domain of a few. Now it was the domain of none. Some scholars also point to the possibility of disease. Though direct evidence is scarce, the collapse of trade routes and urban centers could well have been worsened by the spread of plague or other epidemics. A world already starving, burning, and shaken may also have been sick. The human toll of such overlapping catastrophes is difficult to imagine. In the end, it wasn't a single domino that brought down the Bronze Age. It was the collapse of a system so complex, so intertwined, that when one part failed, the others quickly followed. Climate weakened agriculture. Famine sparked rebellion. Rebellion opened the gates to invasion. Invasion severed trade. The loss of trade shattered economies. And behind it all, a fragile political order, built on wealth, hierarchy, and control, proved incapable of adapting to change. This is what we mean when we speak of a system's collapse. The Bronze Age world had been beautiful, intricate, and ambitious, but it was also brittle. In its pursuit of order, it had lost its resilience. When the pressures came, it could not bend. It broke. And yet, in the wake of that collapse, the story did not end. In the silence that followed the Bronze Age collapse, the world seemed to hold its breath. Cities that once rang with the sound of trade, ceremony, and song stood quiet. Writing systems vanished. International diplomacy ceased. The great empires of the Eastern Mediterranean, Mycenae, Hatti, Ugarit, faded into legend. For centuries afterward, it was as if the lights had gone out on an entire civilization. And yet, out of the ashes of that collapse, a new world began to form. This was not a return to the past, but a slow, painful transformation. The Eastern Mediterranean entered what some historians have called a dark age, marked by decentralization, reduced populations, and the near-total disappearance of long-distance trade. But even in darkness, seeds were being sown, seeds that would grow into the great cultures of the Iron Age. The Israelites in Canaan, the Arameans in Syria, the early Greeks who would one day birth democracy, philosophy, and drama. In Greece, the memory of the Mycenaean world survived in the form of myth. Stories once told by palace scribes were now sung by traveling bards. The epics of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey echo with distant memories of Bronze Age heroes and battles. Though shaped by legend, these tales preserved the outline of a world that had been lost. In their verses, we glimpse a cultural legacy reaching across centuries, from the burning citadels of 1200 BCE to the classical world of 500 BCE. Elsewhere, survivors adapted. In the Levant, smaller city-states rose where great kingdoms once ruled. Phoenician merchants rebuilt trade networks and carried their alphabet, one of the most revolutionary inventions of the ancient world, across the Mediterranean. Unlike cuneiform or hieroglyphs, the Phoenician script was accessible, efficient, and easy to learn. It would become the foundation for Greek, Latin, and eventually the alphabets we use today. In this way, even amid collapse, progress emerged. In Egypt, despite its battered condition, the new kingdom survived the chaos and endured, though never again would it dominate as it once had. The pharaohs of the 21st dynasty looked not to expand, but to hold together the remnants of a fractured world. In their tombs and inscriptions, we sense a shift in tone, from triumph to preservation, from glory to survival. But what, ultimately, can we learn from the Bronze Age collapse? At its core, the collapse was not just a tale of destruction. It was a story about complexity. The Bronze Age world was globalized in its own way. Vast networks of trade, diplomacy, and culture linked people across continents. These systems brought prosperity, but also created vulnerability. When one part failed, whether due to drought, war, or economic strain, the rest followed. What we see in the 12th century BCE is not just a series of local crises, but the breakdown of an interconnected world order. The lesson is timeless. We live today in a world perhaps more interconnected than ever before. Our economies, technologies, and societies are built upon complex systems. Like the Bronze Age civilizations, we benefit from cooperation across borders. But we are also vulnerable to shocks, climate change, conflict, pandemics, and economic collapse. The fall of the Bronze Age warns us what can happen when complexity outpaces resilience. But it also offers hope. Out of the ruins of the late Bronze Age came innovation. New political structures, new philosophies, and new languages. Iron tools replaced bronze. City-states evolved into republics and empires. The alphabet democratized knowledge. Collapse, painful though it was, cleared the way for reinvention. History does not always march forward in a straight line. Sometimes it stumbles. Sometimes it falls, but each collapse contains the seeds of renewal, if we are wise enough to recognize them. So as we look back on the Bronze Age collapse, we are not simply mourning a lost world. We are also bearing witness to a transformation, one that reshaped the ancient world and echoes through our own. Beneath the rubble, beyond the silence, the future was already beginning. Across the ancient lands, from the crumbled palaces of Mycenae to the blackened ruins of Ugarit, the collapse of the Bronze Age stands as one of the most haunting chapters in human history. It was not a single event, but a series of cascading failures, a slow-motion disintegration of a globalized, highly organized world. It was a time when entire civilizations vanished from the historical record, when writing systems fell silent, when trade routes dried up, and when mighty kings were dethroned or forgotten altogether. And yet the story did not end in fire and silence. The collapse was not merely a death, it was a rebirth. Out of the trauma of destruction came the seeds of the Iron Age. New societies emerged, shaped by the memory of what had come before but forged through the crucible of change. Languages evolved, technologies advanced, and new philosophies and belief systems began to take root. The legacy of the Bronze Age lived on, in the myths of Homer, in the legal codes of the Hebrews, in the seafaring of the Phoenicians, and in the very letters we use to write today. The world did not return to what it was, but it moved forward in new, unexpected ways. The collapse taught the ancient world hard lessons about dependency, complexity, and resilience, lessons that echo into our own time. We too live in a world of immense interconnection and fragile systems. The collapse of long ago reminds us how even the most powerful societies can fall. Not always through conquest, but through the quiet failure of structures too complicated to sustain themselves in the face of crisis. But as the Bronze Age shows us, collapse is not the end. It is a turning point, a moment of reckoning and reinvention. From darkness, there can come light. From ruins, there can rise something new. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not just about the past. It is a mirror held up to the present, and perhaps a guide to the future.